To panel 5, Exile in Modern Times. My name is Simone Blaschka. I'm the director of the German Immigration Center, that is a museum about 300 years of immigration from and to Germany. Before we start, let me welcome and introduce our three speakers, Emilie Kutash, Malte Spitz, and Ganor. Welcome. I start with the introduction of Emilie Kutash. She is specialized, for example, in ancient philosophy, Neoplatonism, medieval philosophy, and history of philosophy and science. She's currently lecturer at the Salem State University and Endicott College for Philosophy. Her career up to 2007 was in the field of psychology. She was a research fellow at the Boston University Center for Philosophy and the History of Science for over 10 years from 1998 on. Her latest publication is Goddesses of Pagan Myth and Cultural Memory. Malte Spitz is a research associate and doctoral candidate at the Axel Springer Chair for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History, Exile and Migration at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt Oder, Germany. He's also at the Selma Stern Center Research Group, Literary Practices of Interdependences, Jewish Writing in the European Diaspora from the 19th century and the 20th century. In his dissertation, he is investigating aspects and constellations of writing in the diaspora on the basis of the work and influence of the Prague writer and musician Hermann Gupp. Dr. Ganor is assistant professor of history at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where she teaches courses on the history of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. Ganor is currently working on a book manuscript about the global dispersion of German-speaking Jewish refugees. This project traces the emergence and crystallization of a German Jewish diaspora and analyzes the everyday experiences of displacement that define this diasporic community. Supported, among others, by the Historical Institute and Studienstiftung des start the presentation of Emilie Kutash. Thank you. Emilie, you can start with your presentation now, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was fortunate enough to have Hans Jonas as a professor at the New School for Social Research. As some of you may know, his family donated many of his papers and books to the Leo Baeck Institute. Jonas's relation to Germany reflects poignantly the complex and nuanced position that many refugees from Nazi Germany experienced. He loved his homeland, his native tongue, and then experienced the trauma of being betrayed and exiled. Jonas changed from an idealistic youth studying at German universities, having Heidegger as a mentor. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I was fortunate enough to have Hans Jonas as a professor at the New School for Social Research. As some of you may know, his family donated many of his papers and books to the Leo Baeck Institute. Jonas's relation to Germany reflects poignantly the complex and nuanced position that many refugees from Nazi Germany experienced. He loved his homeland, his native tongue, and then experienced the trauma of being betrayed and exiled. Jonas changed from an idealistic youth studying at German universities, having Heidegger as a mentor. Can you hear me? To a post-war reassessment. I was fortunate enough to have Hans Jonas as a professor at the New School for Social Research. As some of you may know, his family donated many of his papers and books to the Leo Baeck Institute. Jonas's relation to Germany reflects poignantly the complex and nuanced position that many refugees from Nazi Germany experienced. He loved his homeland, his native tongue, and then experienced the trauma of being betrayed and exiled. Jonas changed from an idealistic youth studying at German universities, having Heidegger as a mentor. Can you hear me? To a post-war reassessment of his early allegiances. As a professor at the New School for Social Research. As some of you may know, something is wrong. Something is wrong. To the Leo Baeck Institute. Jonas's relation to Germany reflects. Can we start all over again? What? An idealistic youth studying at German universities, having Heidegger as a mentor. Can you hear me? To a post-war reassessment of his early allegiances. As a professor at the New School for I don't know what to do. Something is wrong. Jonas's relation to Germany. What?
So, hi, and let me say a quick thank you to the invitation and to have the chance to share some points of my research on the barely unknown writer and musician Hermann Gupp from Prague. I hope you can see my presentation now. It is actually almost exactly 80 years ago today that Hermann Gupp left the Portuguese steamboat on Thursday, December 5, 1940, and entered the port of New York City. By then, the first snow of the year had already been fallen, and in the meantime, it had probably turned itself into a mixture of exhaust fumes and water, coloring into a dark gray. As Gupp soon described the atmosphere during his arrival, the snow laid down on a spacious square of the battery, close to the ocean and outside on the islands, Ellis Island, Governor's Island, Bedloe's Island, piled up at the feet of the Statue of Liberty and remained in small hollows on its head and shoulders until the early hours in the morning, while it held out the electrically lit torch to the arriving travelers in this pearly gray and white landscape. At the same time as Hermann Gupp arrived in New York, his instruments were already waiting for him after having safely crossed the Atlantic. Among them was a more than 150-year-old pianoforte from the workshop of the famous Augsburg piano maker Johann Andreas Stein, whose keyboards Mozart already played. Via Paris, Hermann Gupp had been able to have a few pieces of his collection of old instruments shipped to America. They now received those in exile who, without them, would probably not have been able to flee within and out of Europe, now offering a future abroad. As important tools, they formed the foundation of his soon-to-be-founded music school in New York. The writer and pianist Hermann Gupp, who was born in 1903 in the German-speaking Jewish upper-middle classes of Prague, fled Prague in February 1939. One could therefore say rather late. His parents and grandparents had contributed a lot to the German culture of Prague and still thought being safe despite the Munich Agreement from 1938. The occasion for Grupp's departure was at last a piano concert that his brother Leo arranged. On March 1st, 1939, he played in the Salle Pleyel in Paris, a central address for the city's concert life for exiled people and Parisians alike. Just a few days before the German troops marched into Prague, Gupp realized in Paris that a return to his hometown was no longer possible. The mother of the two could not be convinced to leave Prague. She died in Woods at the end of 41. In the spring of 1940, Hermann Gupp was declared eligible by the Czechoslovakian army in exile in France, but was not obliged to serve at the front. His prominence had saved him from combat duty. As part of a group of musicians, he gave concert for the Czech soldiers. It was not only during the German invasion of France that Gupp and his brother's family, apparently at the last moment that was still possible, as he wrote in July 1940, set off from Paris in the direction of Portugal. Barely 2 weeks later, and after several stops at the French Atlantic coast, he arrived in Lisbon. A letter from Gupp describes the equilibrium of this life, for him one of the strangest experiences. Obtaining exit visas, entry permits, and transit, everyday issues of immigration. 3 months later, the small group around Gupp was still in Lisbon, and it was not until early December that they were able to make the passage to New York. In his literary work, he processed their escape from Prague. And all of these texts condensed the ruptures suffered on one's own person and the suffering of others. They negotiate the disproportion between suffering and the description of suffering. In view of sorrow, he set out to build a foundation for hope. Shortly after his arrival in America, he began working as a piano teacher. He became a faculty member of the prestigious conservatory, the David Mann's Music School, and eventually founded his own music school, the Music House. Like many other immigrants, Gupp thought that his practical skills would probably allow him to gain foothold in exile more quickly than the continuation of his literary work, which had just begun. As a music teacher, he was then able to keep his head above water financially. Gupp's focus on music teaching is, however, not just a job in exile for him. He was also already engaged in various institutions in Prague. But in New York, this activity became a matter that increasingly took on a social perspective. His teaching method then also followed a general education model that went beyond a purely musical training and assumed that general education and upbringing could be provided through music. In this regard, too, his flight and war experience further sharpened his theoretical approach, inasmuch as Gupp reacted to the threatened destruction of Europe's heritage by seeking to impart his own knowledge to the next generation. The teaching is preserved at a fundamental level because it is rehearsed on instruments. In Gupp's view, it was music in particular that had the ability to impart values to people after the war, because, unlike the masterpieces of literature, music did not require a great deal of prior knowledge. Rather, it could be received straight away. In one of his texts, he prefers to think of the order and measure of pre-classical music to that of Wagner, for example, who appears to be an active collaborator of Hitler. Convenient music, in contrast, could serve as a model for the, as it is said, young people in Germany who are shaped by, and I quote, mass and barrierless racial egoism, end of quote. For Gupp, music had community building power. He was thus concerned with a kind of musical re-education, which was to give rise to a new cosmopolitanism and to convey the interconnections of European music history. What can be observed in Hermann Gupp as an example is a practice that is in a way object-bound. Collecting, storing, and playing becomes graspable as a transmission of knowledge. This knowledge is realized through media, and in Gupp's case, musical instruments. Intellectual but also everyday expertise is thus revealed. As it is distinctive for the existence in the diaspora, this knowledge is constantly reframed and, in his case, musically used. Gupp's instruments are a perfect illustration in this regard. He brought them from Mozart's past to his present-day Prague when he first acquired them. At the same time, he brought the knowledge of the traditions of Jewish and Austrian music into his Prague networks. He has not only handed down the relations to these artifacts, but also preserved them. For his contemporaries, he first made it possible to experience how music sounded in Mozart's time and conveyed how it has changed in sound since. Elements are added, other nuances forgotten, while developing over centuries. The same applies to Gupp's interests themselves. He now developed a new enthusiasm for early music. After having worked with contemporary music before, he finally, after the war, explained that all this knowledge needs to be used anew after the catastrophe. This knowledge apparently has again an eminently social dimension beyond the history of music. The knowledge is passed on as well as stored, changing all the time. His instruments have been grateful to Gupp for this, one might say, for they enabled him to build up a humble, pragmatic, and idealistic future. In other words, they saved each other from oblivion for several times. In speaking about Gupp's instruments, one might follow the notion that rescued objects are now the bearers of the memories of the murdered, because they too stand for all those and that which could not have been saved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malte Spitz, and we are now looking forward for the presentation of Shir Ganor. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and for the conference organizers for inviting me to participate. I have to apologize in case you are hearing strange noises. There's a pretty serious construction work taking place outside my window right now, and I really hope that you can't hear it, but if yes, I do apologize. And I'm going to try to speak loudly so that it doesn't interfere with the presentation. So I want to start by reading you a letter that was published in March 1940 in the New York-based German Jewish newspaper, The Aufbau. And I'm quoting now. Dear Mrs. Scott, we arrived in this country a few months ago, and as a competent housewife, I've been fortunate to quickly find a position in a large household. My husband has so far not been as fortunate and in finding a source of income. He suffers greatly from the fact that me and our 18-year-old son provide for the household while he cannot contribute. My husband takes care of the housekeeping, learns English diligently, and is constantly on the search for a job. With every unsuccessful attempt, he sinks deeper into depression, a sense of uselessness and feeling inferior. For me, it is also not easy. When I return exhausted from work in the evening, I sit in front of a silent, melancholic man. I would be just as delighted as he would if he were to find something, not so much for the money, but because a healthy man needs an occupation and ages prematurely when he doesn't have one. Yours, R.S. This letter was published in an advice column that was titled Hilde Scott Diskutiert, Probleme des Alltags. Hilde Scott discusses the problems of the everyday. In 1939 and 1940, the Aufbau printed about 24 columns like this one that comprised of a letter from a reader soliciting Hilde Scott's advice. And Scott then responded to their quandaries. The letters represented an array of these so-called problems of the everyday, from the difficulties of living hand to mouth to the uncertainties of dating. The letters were written by German Jewish refugees. They were considered and reflected by a German Jewish refugee, that is Hilde Scott herself. And they were circulated throughout the broader refugee community, not only in the United States, where the Aufbau was based, but throughout the world. The Aufbau had a pretty robust international subscription base. The readers who sought Scott's advice in this column, they shared personal moments from their private lives, and they did so almost always anonymously. But their concerns resonated with the Aufbau's readership more broadly, a community of displaced German-speaking Jews whose everyday was structured and burdened by these shared concerns that were expressed in the column. The open discussion of readers' questions, even delicate and intimate issues, portrayed the dilemmas that they dealt with as a matter of collective interest rather than just an individual problem. This, in fact, was the intended goal of this advice column. Hilde Scott's response to the troubled wife of the melancholic man emphasized precisely that point. Scott opened her answer by writing, "Your letter moved me greatly because it is not the letter of one woman and wife. Hundreds of women could have written it." Scott's advice column was an intentional space for addressing common difficulties faced by the German Jewish refugee population. Hilde Scott's column gave us an insight into how the so-called everyday functions in the midst of a crisis. Probleme des Alltags reveals how deeply disorienting events like violent persecution and forced migration are mirrored in supposedly mundane moments and events. This is one of the main focal points of my book manuscript. In this project, I study the history of the German Jewish diaspora by piecing together quotidian moments and gestures from the everyday lives of German-speaking refugees who fled National Socialist persecution. The documents of the everyday that I explore convey a sense of urgency, of plight, uncertainty, and also fortitude. They fuse together the day-to-day affairs with life-altering events, and that is why I see them as so productive in developing an understanding of displacement as a lived reality. Working on this project, I've encountered countless primary sources that testify to this duality of rupture and routine in German Jewish communities throughout the world. Probleme des Alltags is unique amongst these sources because it explicitly recognized and addressed the everyday as a site for confronting the shocks of displacement. Let me say just a bit about the columnist herself. Hilde Stern, she was born in 1900 in Breslau. Her family was very paradigmatic of these shared histories that we're focusing on in this conference. Her parents, William and Clara Stern, they were both renowned scholars in the field of child developmental psychology. Her brother, Gunther Stern, is better known as Gunther Anders. He was Hannah Arendt's first husband. And one of her cousins was Walter Benjamin. So it's a family with quite the credentials. Scott was a social worker by training. She was very active in left-wing circles and identified with communism, even though she herself was never a party member. Her first marriage to Rudolf Schottlander ended in a divorce, and she raised both of her children alone in Hamburg, where she worked at the unemployment office as a caseworker. As a civil servant, she lost her position once the Nazis were in power. And then she started working as a social worker within Jewish community organizations. She got involved with the underground communist resistance groups and was discovered in these activities, had to spend 2 years in prison. And in 1937, she was released upon the condition that she leave Germany immediately and then immigrated together with her children to the United States. Living in New York, she started working with several German-speaking publications, as well as providing her services as a social worker to refugee aid organizations. After the war, she and her second husband returned to live in the GDR, where she died in 1961. So she was one of these people who we heard about in Anna Koch's beautiful presentation in the last panel. Living in New York, in the advice column that Scott published with the Aufbau, her responses drew from all of these different aspects in her life, from her professional expertise as a social worker, from her political leanings, from her role as a mother, and of course, her own fate as a refugee was also of great significance in her reflections. Some of Scott's responses read not only as words of advice, but as part of a larger conversation about the predicament of German-speaking Jewry in the era of Nazi rule. For example, her response to a letter that was titled "Immigrants All, Americans All." This letter came from a concerned mother of an 18-year-old son. Their family had been in the United States for about a year or so. And during the recent months, so the mother is writing, the son had joined a German-American youth group. His social life started revolving around more or less only teenagers who were themselves recent arrivals from Germany. And this has become a source of concern for his mother, who tried to persuade him to seek American friends, to speak more English, to get better accustomed to their new home. This mother stated in her letter, "I believe that it is pointless to hold on to German traditions. We Jews should be assimilating as soon as possible." In her answer to this letter, Scott began, first of all, by stating her agreement with the importance of acclimatizing to the ways of the new land, but she disagreed with the letter writer on the issue of holding on to the ways of the old homeland. In the US, she wrote, "Adhering to one's culture does not prevent assimilation to American society." And she added, and I'm quoting, "There is no cause to get rid of our good German cultural heritage. Today, when brute violence suffocates all culture in Germany, is it not the duty of German Jews in particular to act as guardians of the culture in which we were raised and our children were raised? It is not those who lose loyalty to their own heritage that will become the most loyal to America. We Jews know that from our history better than anyone." In this exchange that was published in the Aufbau, we see a miniature version of a discussion that gripped communities of displaced German-speaking Jews throughout their dispersion. Questions about the means of integration, about the fate of Germany and of German culture, about the destruction of a population and the safekeeping of its heritage. These questions were prevalent on the pages of the Aufbau and in the everyday experiences of German Jewish refugees more broadly. This prodding and probing of German Jewishness took place in an advice column that was devoted to problems of the everyday, and it appeared alongside very mundane questions like, are children listening to radio too much? Or is it wise to buy clothes in installment payments? And this juxtaposition, it might seem jarring, but these were, in fact, the daily problems of German Jewish refugees as they dealt with them in rebuilding their lives in dispersion. Scott's responses to the questions that she received from readers were sometimes more and sometimes less thoughtful. But what they did was they offered readers guiding principles for adjusting to their everyday in the aftermath of forced migration. In her column, the letters were not treated as private matters that concerned the authors alone, but as matters of public interest that affected the German Jewish diaspora as a collective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganor. And now we have the presentation of Emilie Kutash.
So Hans Jonas' relation to Germany reflects poignantly The complex and nuanced position that many refugees experience, the trauma of being betrayed and exiled, even though loving his homeland and native tongue. Jonas changed from an idealistic youth studying at German universities and having Heidegger as a mentor to a post-war reassessment of his earlier allegiances. After traumatic events that included the murder of his mother by the Nazis and his necessary departure from Germany, he, quote from Lawrence Vogel, enabled an exodus not only from his native country, but from German philosophy as well. In the 1920s, he had written a dissertation with Heidegger and wrote a groundbreaking book on Gnosticism. After the war, he saw Gnosticism as a pernicious nihilism that implicated all of German philosophy. Before the war, Jonas was an avid devotee of Husserl, Heidegger, German philosophy, but now he saw Heidegger's existentialism as a denigration of worldliness, a sterile, death-like fixedness that violated nature and what it is to be human. Heidegger, Jonas's beloved mentor, had joined the Nazi Party, and he tied this to the ethical vacuum at the heart of German philosophy. His first book after the war, The Phenomenon of Life, published in 1966, created a philosophy of the organism, of life, rather than death, and advocated for a responsibility toward life as an antidote to what he called the, quote, terrible anonymity of idealistic philosophy. He created pioneering ideas in environmental and medical ethics. Philosophy is certainly a strange place to situate the origin of evil, but Jonas implicated philosophy itself as a factor in the unspeakable horrors of Nazism. Hans Jonas followed a pattern common to Jewish philosophers, including Leo Baeck, who lived through the same events that he did. He described how, when he was 11 in his memoirs, his family was gripped by patriotic fervor at the outset of World War I. Though his father was raised as an Orthodox Jew, his family was essentially secular, and he spoke High German. He describes the strong Jewish presence at the University of Berlin in the 1920s when he attended. An extraordinarily diverse, famous, accomplished Jewish intellectual came out of the German university systems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They're exposed to science and theory in every field. These advantages far outweigh the small price they had to pay in face of the anti-Semitism that came with Jewish assimilation. A prime example of denial was the almost delusional German-Jewish symbiosis envisioned by the Jewish Hermann Gupp, whose neo-Kantian philosophy was popular in German universities. Cohen called Germany the spiritual homeland of the Jews. Long after Cohen's death, his wife died in Theresienstadt at the age of 82. Hans Jonas, Sigmund Freud, Martin Buber, Emmanuel Levinas, and Leo Baeck all were taught neo-Kantianism and Hegelianism in universities where they were dominated ideologies. It is reported that Leo Baeck taught Kant and Plato in the concentration camp. These were what Wolin calls delusions of assimilation. All of this came to an abrupt end in 1933. In the 1930 elections, more than 6 million Germans voted for the Nazi Party. This affected intellectuals in a very personal way. For example, for intellectuals, it was a horror that there was a public book burning. Freud remarked, what progress we are making in the Middle Ages, what progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are only burning my books. Now Jews were expelled from the National Academy, government positions, schools, research institutes, and universities. More than 50 professors were expelled from, example, from the University of Göttingen, which was a world-renowned center of advanced physics. There's an expensive literature about how the traumatic impact of the Holocaust overwhelms the understanding. Writers such as Jean-Améry, Stefan Zweig, and others, even as late as 20 years after the traumatic Holocaust experiences, committed suicide. Hans Jonas' outrage took a more direct form. He volunteered in 1939 for the Jewish Brigade of the British Army. He experienced a life and death battle on the Italian front, which inspired many of his innovations in philosophy. His biological philosophy, rooted in the world of nature, included the human struggle to survive. As we have recently seen in America, where statues of past heroes who are racists have been attacked and removed, Jonas, after the war, attacked the teachings of the German philosophical founding fathers. Unlike the writers I just mentioned, he did not bottle up his resentment. He made war by attacking the philosophical tradition. In his mind, it had led to Nazi atrocities and exclusion of anyone who was other than a spiritual, idealized nationalist German. By 1935, Jonas had left Germany permanently and emigrated to the British Protectorate of Palestine. Here he fought again in the Israeli army and entered a second stage of his theoretical life. Philosophy now became an antidote to the horrors he had known, as was his pioneering ideas in areas of medical and environmental ethics. They all affirmed human responsibility to life, not death. In his memoirs, he described as a youth fistfights he had engaged in when overhearing anti-Semitic remarks. He described himself as being flooded with Maccabean rage. When it came to Heidegger, Jonas's outrage was most virulent. He had been among the young Jews that had flocked to study with Heidegger in Marburg, which included Hannah Arendt. A decisive turning point of Jonas's intellectual transformation was the shock he received concerning Heidegger's affiliation to National Socialism. When Jonas was asked whether Heidegger's conduct in the year 1933 had anything to do with his philosophy, he said the following, quote, that when the most profound thinker of my time fell into step with the thundering march of Hitler's brown battalions, it was not merely a bitter personal disappointment for me, but in my eyes, a debacle for philosophy. Philosophy itself, not only a man, had declared bankruptcy. Jonas did not just attack Heidegger, but all of European philosophy. He claimed that idealistic philosophers were too sheltered from, quote, the shock of the external, unquote, regarding it as a mere spectacle, a representation on a stage. In his critique of Kant, Jonas conjured up the Holocaust as the example of the direct language of reality. He added, quote, and when in horror we look at the pictures from Buchenwald, all the wasted bodies and distorted faces, at the utter defilement of humanity, we reject the consolation that this is appearance and that truth is something else. We face the terrible truth that appearance is the reality, and there is nothing more real than what here appears. Philosophy, for Jonas, had utterly failed after the challenge of real life. A little bit more. After the war, Jonas's youthful enthusiasm for the University of Berlin, for Berlin cultural life, and later for Heideggerian ideas is a sharp contrast to the grief, wrath, and bitterness after the war and the murder of his mother by the Nazis. After the war, Jonas turned down all efforts from German universities, no matter how attractive. Like the victims of childhood trauma, he was betrayed by the very parents he loved and was attached to. Life itself was more valuable than any totalizing abstract concept, and life was rooted in biology and the material world. Still, as is true of many German Jewish exiles, Jonas held on to lifelong attachment to German cultural heritage. As he describes in his memoirs, for him, the Greek myths of Homer fighting at the gates of Troy, of the German myths of the gods Baldur or Wotan and the Ferris wolf had greater impact on him than the biblical stories of Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark. Jonas knew German culture and was given to recite German literature. He knew Goethe, Schiller, and Heine through and through. As far as the German language was concerned, ambivalence was a notable feature of German Jewish writers. Franz Rosenzweig had suggested early on that Jews were subject to a foreign language, yet it was their native tongue. He called it the language of the host. Franz Kafka, concerning the German Jewish writers, stated that they lived among the impossibility of not writing, as they could get rid of their inspiration only by writing, and the impossibility of writing in German. Hannah Arendt, when she was stripped of her citizenship by the Nazis when living in Paris, asked about Nazism and her attachment to the German language, said, quote, "After all, it is not the German language that has gone mad. And in the second place, nothing can replace the mother tongue." At the age of 70, Jonas returned to the German language in composing The Imperative of Responsibility, acknowledging that his mother tongue enabled him to better articulate in the way he intended to. This book granted him recognition and honor in Germany, which he now visited regularly. The terrible losses of the emigres' forced exile from the former motherland was not simply something that could be dismissed with rage, but needed reparations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your presentations. Do you have questions for each other? We are now in the discussion.
I do have questions to both of my co-panelists, but if there are questions from the audience, then we could start with, I don't know, what do you think, Simone?
At the moment, we have no questions from the audience, so please start with your question.
Okay, so the question that I wanted to ask Malte was, you ended your wonderful presentation with speaking about how rescued objects are now the medium through which we hear about the lives of the people who used to own them and interact with them. And as I told you, I also work with objects in my work, and sometimes I have a difficulty with this. What would we be able to know about the people only through the objects themselves? So because it's a question that I pose myself, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. And to Emilie, I was wondering, you used the quote, "Delusions of Assimilation," and I wonder in what ways did it come to an end in 1933, when this sort of lifelong attachment that you're describing, that even someone like Hans Jonas, who was more of a pushing back against the symbiosis than other people in his cohort, even he himself returned later in life to writing in German. If just would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Okay, go ahead, and I'll go second. You had asked.
Okay, I just start, yeah. Thank you for this question. That's a really good question, but it's pretty hard to answer, I guess, because I try to in my research, I just take the instruments of Hermann Gupp because I, of course, know something about him in the beginning at first. So I try to, I feel like that his fate or his life was kind of reflected on his instruments, and the instruments themselves kind of reflected their history and their practice, their object boundness back to his life. So to your question, if we just have the objects and don't know anything about the people owning these objects, it's a different relation, I guess. So yeah, it would be pretty tough to figure something out without having any information about the owners.
Okay, shall I go? Shall I go?
Yes.
Yes. Shall I answer the question about delusions of assimilation? I think that there were very different periods during the 20s and early 30s. I think that the Jewish intellectual philosophers were still very sticking to the idea that they were very much part of German intellectual life. And I think the shock of the Holocaust and the war sort of shook them out of this delusion. And slowly they were able to, I mean, I noted that the writers committed suicide, and I have a long list of people who did, intellectuals, after 20 years after the war. On the other hand, somebody like Hans Jonas and others somehow worked through their rage and was able to not re-assimilate, but somehow get in touch with their early memories of what they loved about German culture and the German language. So in a very long study that I'm working on, that about trauma and how it relates to how these intellectuals attack German idealistic philosophy, I think that some of this follows the history of trauma in general, where there's either buried resentment or active rage. And I think Hans Jonas experiencing his active anger, fighting in the British and Israeli army, and then attacking Heidegger and philosophy, was an outlet that enabled him to resolve and eventually reconcile with some of his love for Germany.
Thank you. We do have a remark from the audience that especially the German language was very important for Hans Jonas, but the remark says it was not for the second generation, not for his family. So do you have an explanation for that or any comment?
I've been reading his memoirs, which I advise anyone to read because they're fascinating and very detailed. And he definitely brought up his children and his family in Westchester, very assimilated to American society. And I don't, and I think he spent many years as a professor at the New School and in Canada, you know, living this life. And I think this was something he came to more in his 70s, from what I can gather, where he was able to remember what he loved about German culture. So I don't know if that was after his children were grown up, and or whether he conveyed, you know, this to his children. I don't remember anything in his memoirs about that. It's an interesting question. I think many people in the second generation, and like my grandparents and from Russia, you know, I think they keep their former culture to themselves somehow. That's a whole other issue. And they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. Do you have, Malte or Shia, do you have any thoughts about the second generation?
Me?
No.
I can just say for my case and with Hermann Gupp, it is, you can only guess because he already died in 49, but he had a wife, and which she was from Belgium, she immigrated from Belgium, and she had a son, and I only know that his family was then, they tried to kind of forget their past. They switched to English. They, as you can tell, maybe they assimilate to American culture, and they thought of all the memories his father or Hermann Gupp had. There's everything from this case is private. So they didn't have really the conscious that this might be historical research. You should research on that, and it is private. Yeah, it's maybe for the second generation.
I think that it is quite typical of German Jewish refugee families to sort of stop the very strong cultural attachment to Germany with the generation that had personally experienced the forced removal. I recall now from Leo Spitzer's work where he, I think, correctly noted that to the extent that German Jewish parents were able to instill in their children anything like a German heritage, then it was a constructed, nostalgic one, and not necessarily, and I don't know what an authentic German Jewishness is, but it's something that they had fostered internally, and not a strong sense of a German Jewish identity. And there were some anxieties about that early in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Some immigrant organizations, including the Leo Baeck Institute, that had some anxieties around the issue of whether or not German Jewish culture is a culture that is facing extinction because of this inability and also unwillingness to communicate the cultural attachment further to the second generation.
Thank you. We do have a question for you, Shir, from Anna Koch. She's asking, do you know why Hilde Scott decided to return? Is it anti-communism? Do you know what she did after the war?
Anna, I actually need to get in touch with you about this. So her second husband they met in New York. Her second husband was Hans Machwitzer, who was something of a big shot in the DDR's cultural and educational ministry. And they decided to go back together. And I hadn't had the opportunity to look at his private collection, which is at the Akademie der Künste. I was supposed to do it this summer, but we all know how that turned out. So I do wonder whether her return to Germany was more influenced by his decision to return, or to what extent was that also her own initiative. I don't know a lot about her life after the war, unfortunately. I do hope that looking at his collection will tell me more about that. But she was, at least communist-leaning in her political ideology. So when I learned that she returned, it wasn't a huge surprise.
Okay, thank you. And another question for Malte. Yesterday, Tamar Lewinsky talked about objects of immigration. She seemed to suggest that choice of object rather than the object itself was most significant. The question is from Amy Shevitz.
So when I get the question right, it was about the object is selecting the person, or I didn't really get it. Sorry.
It's a kind of the correct. I think she means the curator is choosing the object, and or someone else is choosing the object. It's not the object that speaks. It's the curator or the person who chooses the object.
Okay. Yeah, in my case, it's probably pretty easy to answer because Hermann Gupp had a practical relation to these objects. He hoped that when he can transfer these objects to America, he can use it and build a future with them. It's not just an object you can put in your cupboard and look at it. It is not something you can tell. You can, yeah. He had to use it. He wanted to found a music school with it. Am I correct answering like this? Or
Amy just make a joke. She's saying emigrating with a piano would not be a picnic. That's a joke. Jewish violinists. So
that's a crucial point, and the reason why I tried to introduce Hermann Gupp with his pianos today, because I think it's a crazy story that he was able to have not just one instrument but also like 3 instruments shipped to America, and they even made the passage before himself. So they were first. They kind of welcomed him in exile and had the ability to have a future already for him kind of set up. So there's a big, I mean, a big singularity in the histories of the flight and exile, I guess. He was able to have this instrument shipped to America.
Yes, thank you very much. I look at the time, and we are nearly at the end. So thank you all very much for your papers and your presentation. It's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.